Good morning. My name is Judyth Sachs. I'm Chief Academic Officer for Studiosity. I want to acknowledge that I am hosting this online conversation from the lands of the Cammeraygal people. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this meeting, and the First Nations people across Canada and New Zealand if they are also participating. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters, not only of New South Wales, but elsewhere in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. Today is our first symposium for 2024. Its focus is on AI and academic integrity. We plan to deliver several more during this year, and we'll keep you posted. The symposium and webinars provide the higher education community with the opportunity to engage in conversation and trigger ideas about challenges and issues that are facing us all. I found a very interesting paper by Jeremy Harper in LinkedIn, and it just gave me pause to think about something that might be, I'll get each of the participants to respond to. But before I do that, if I could ask the participants to just introduce themselves and how they come to have expertise in this area of AI and integrity. So Jennie, could we start with you?
Yes. Good morning, Judyth. Good morning, everyone. So my name's Professor Jennie Shaw, and I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Vice President Academic at the University of Adelaide. And we have, I think, now an entire academic integrity network, not just a team, and that sits under me. So I take a daily active interest in this area.
Thank you. If we could then have Jason, I'm just reading how you come across the screen, so there's no sort of gender bias, it's just purely what's happening in front of me. So Jason.
Thanks, Judyth. Hi, everyone. Jason Lodge. I'm the Deputy Associate Dean Academic in the Faculty of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Queensland. I have a lab, and my lab and I work on issues around the interface with technology and learning. So we're really interested in what technologies and the evolving technologies mean for how we learn and how those technologies might help facilitate learning. And a lot of the work that I've been involved in over the last year includes thinking about assessment, academic integrity in higher education with that particular lens of putting learning first. And that involves, the work that we've done in partnership with TEQSA around assessment reform for the age of AI. So that's me.
And finally, Helen.
Thank you, Judyth. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Dr. Helen Gniel. I'm the Director of the Higher Education Integrity Unit at TEQSA. So the unit essentially is there to try and identify and address threats to the integrity of our higher education system. So academic integrity sits with my unit, but also the impact of generative artificial intelligence. And specifically, as Jason said, we're really focused on how, in an age of AI, where tools can produce so many of the artifacts that we've traditionally relied on as evidence of learning, what do we need to do as a sector? What do we need to transform to make sure we can still be sure that individuals are graduating with the necessary skills, knowledge, and experience to be safe practitioners?
Thank you. And I want to thank Jason for something that he referred me to through LinkedIn, and it was the Gartner hype cycle. And I think that this is really quite interesting because the Gartner hype cycle has the innovation trigger, the peak of inflated expectations, the trough of disillusionment, the slope of enlightenment, and the plateau of productivity. And I advise everybody who's listening to this to actually follow up and have a look at it. And in terms of your own institution, look at where your institution might be. But there was one element in the paper by Jeremy Harper, and it was this. The excitement of AI will now lie not in its novelty, but in its utility. The true test of this next phase is in its adoption and its adaptation. How well can we incorporate these tools into the mundane, making the extraordinary a common fixture of our daily routines? The real excitement isn't the hype, it's in the doing. It's seeing a tool you helped build becoming part of someone's everyday life. So, Jason, given that you were the kind person that directed me to this, what's your response to Jeremy Harper's observation?
I think it's a good one. And I think it fits broadly with what we've seen with the evolution and implementation of educational technologies for a long time. We do tend to go through these cycles of hype and then eventually finding a kind of medium. And some of those things we now take for granted. You know, the very tool that we're using right now to do this webinar is something that we grappled with, you know, a few years ago and was quite difficult. But now we almost take it for granted that this is something that we can do. AI is a little bit different, I think, because it represents a different kind of human-machine relationship. It's much more interactive rather than transactional, which a lot of previous technologies were, although allowed broadcast or other kinds of means. But I think ultimately we've got a lot of work to do to figure out where the interface is between these new technologies and education broadly, not just higher education, but it's a broader problem. So how that cycle is going to play out for us here is hard to tell, but so far it looks like it's following a similar path, but perhaps an accelerated one.
Helen, would you like to respond to that from the regulator's point of view?
Yeah, I think that's all right. I think the issue with things that have these cycles and then they settle into some kind of comfortable, manageable system is that the reality is there's a lot of people shaping that. It's not something that just happens because that's a natural cycle or part of a condition. It happens because people shape it and regulate it in particular ways and incentivize it in the right ways. So I agree, but I think the challenge for all of us is we're the ones in this sector trying to kind of work out what it means and what we need to transform and then do that really challenging work of transforming.
And Jennie?
Yeah, I think, look, part of this is in that cycle, we all get on at different points too. So I'd say at Adelaide, because we had the Australian Institute for Machine Learning, we were kind of early adopters of the Gen AI issues because we knew it was coming. We'd seen versions of it in-house. But I think it's once you're on that trajectory or part of that cycle, it's how you move through it. And I think Jason's point is it's yet another new tool, new technology. I think it proposes really great ethical issues, but it's in an accelerated format. So I get the feeling at the moment, I feel we're on the top of the wave, but if you stop investigating, if you stop thinking about it, you can be dunked. That's very much my feeling at the moment because everything is moving so quickly.
Okay, well, look, just let me say, indicate what the shape of today is going to be. We've had our introduction for 5 minutes. I'll ask each person on the panel a question, and then during the course of the webinar, I will be looking at the webinar chat. But can I ask people in terms of if they want to ask questions to put it in the Q&A? Otherwise, I'm just sort of having to go back and forth, so that would be really helpful. So questions will be taken from the audience, and then I'll try to bring it together at the end. So my first question, and once again, it's a question that will be asked to all. This time last year, integrity and AI were topics that polarized academics and senior leaders in university. Where are we now in terms of AI, student learning and academic integrity? And Jennie, let's start off with you.
Well, where are we? Again, I think we're on a continuum here, and it's a continuous learning journey for all our staff and all our students. I think what we've done is we've had more time now to reflect on the kinds of materials we need to put out for our staff and our students. So again, certainly what we've done is put out lots of guidelines for staff and students, but we've also thought about how we can use it in a really positive way. And how we can use it to influence our teaching practices, our assessment practices. We've found there's a real enthusiasm and energy for learning about generative AI, and that's amongst our staff and our students. And I'll just give one example. So our library's been instrumental in developing some of these guidelines with us, but they held a masterclass for students and over 400 registered, and that's really phenomenal. So, just to have that level of interest from people in our entire university community wanting to learn about it is actually a really great thing. So I think that outweighs the challenges at this point, but that's certainly where we are. And of course, we've just actually amended all our policies to expressly and explicitly acknowledge generative AI as one of our more recent challenges in that academic integrity continuum.
Jason, where are you at UQ?
Good question. I think for us, we're having a conversation about the complexity of the situation we find ourselves in. I think a year ago, we were thinking a lot about students taking an assessment task, putting it into ChatGPT, getting a response and submitting that. But not only have the tools evolved over the last year, and there are so many of them that it's hard to keep count of them, but also the ways in which all of us collectively, including our students, are using these tools. There are far more sophisticated and complex ways that these tools are being integrated into the ways that students learn. And I think we need to have a conversation about what that means and what that's going to mean for their future in their professions and whatever they end up doing after graduation, and what the alignment is there between the sorts of things that they're doing in their learning and what is going to be useful for them in their long-term careers. So there's a complex set of factors there that it's not just about plugging an assessment in and getting an output, but we really need to take these broader things into account, I think.
And my next question will be, after I've asked Helen, is where do you think we'll be this time next year? So you might think about that. So Helen, where, in terms of the regulator, where
Yeah. So with with my regulator hat on, I think there's a couple of things I'd raise. So where we are as a nation is that we are now about 1 month away from when TEQSA will issue the request for information to every registered provider. So every higher education provider will have to submit a credible action plan that demonstrates what their strategy is. How are they thinking about this as a whole of institution and across the breadth of courses that they offer, across all the locations, and for a diverse cohort of learners. And I think that last point adds another kind of layer of complexity to what Jason was saying. Like, it's very discipline specific, it's very nuanced, but you also have a whole range of equity considerations, diversity and inclusion considerations. And then quite separate to that, you also have the reality that there are a proportion of students who we know are determined to cheat. So not all students are there wanting to do the learning and do the work of learning. We know that from years and years of academic integrity research. So we've got to map that across as well, that kind of responsive regulation that Kane Murdoch and Kath Ellis recently published a paper on. How do you taper your interventions in the right way for the right population of students? Because for the vast majority of students who are doing the right thing and are really keen to learn, we really want them to learn how to make these tools work for them and how to use them to be even better at their future career when they go out there. So it's really complex from a whole range of facets.
So the next question, given that you've still got the floor, where do you think you will be this time next year?
I might duck and take a fairly narrow answer on this because I'm not an educator. I'm not the one in there doing the work. Where I think we'll be as a country, where I hope we'll be, because we've got this request for information, I really hope we'll be in a position where we've been able to identify really interesting ways people have thought about the problem, really interesting ways that they've thought about, for example, how you can make sure you don't design out diversity, through poor or rushed changes to assessment. I think there'll be a whole range of really fascinating and well thought through submissions that we get that we'll then be in a position to share back to the sector to lift the maturity of the entire sector. So that's where I hope we'll be a year from now. I think Australia is lucky to have kind of had a bit of a jump on this issue compared to other jurisdictions and be in a position again where we're driving our whole sector to uplift as one. So no one's penalised for trying to transform. Everyone's transforming at the same time. And I hope a year from now we will have done some of the really challenging thinking and be in a position to be implementing at scale.
Jason, where will UQ be this time next year?
Good question. Still at St Lucia, I hope, and not moved somewhere else. Look, I agree with everything that Helen has said. I think the background to all this is, of course, there is a lot of uncertainty about where the technologies themselves are going to head. And, even talking to AI experts, there's, vast disagreement about the power of the next generation of these tools or whether we've actually reached the limit of the kind of machine learning algorithms that are out there. So for us, we're thinking a lot about this idea of uncertainty, and perhaps this is the world that we need to be thinking about preparing our students for, that we can't predict where the technology is going to evolve. And that's just in the technology sphere, let alone social, political, environmental. So there are a whole lot of factors out there that I think generate an enormous amount of uncertainty. And perhaps that's what we kind of need to focus on. So we're thinking very, very carefully about that. And again, to echo Helen's comments, what does that mean for empowering our coordinators, our unit coordinators and our program coordinators, who are ultimately in the best place to decide how those factors play out in their particular discipline areas and programs? That's difficult because there are workload implications for that. But I think it's really important. We can't just sort of put a blanket rule out there and expect that every program is going to align with that, because we're not best placed to be able to make those decisions. So how do we help the people who are in those places to make the right decisions for their students. It's tricky.
And Jennie?
Yeah, again, I think the really wonderful thing about this is it's discipline specific in lots of ways, but it's a whole of institution discussion, and it really is. We've got a community of practice at Adelaide, which has people, has students, it has staff, it has professional staff, it has researchers in AI, a lot of teaching staff, a lot of people who support teaching and learning design. And in fact, our whole Teaching and Learning Festival in June is going to be on this issue of academic integrity and generative AI. So people have really embraced it as an issue. And to get to Jason's point, the uncertainty is the thing that people feel they really struggle with. So our legal team right at the beginning said, let's set rules. And they were really determined to really set rules around this. And we said, it's evolving so fast. If you set rules, and I know some institutions outside the tertiary sector tried to, in government in particular, those rules are outdated in a matter of weeks. So living with that level of uncertainty as this thing evolves is a really important understanding of part of this. Then it's about mitigating risk, which gets to Helen's points, and the risk across the university and the risk within certain cohorts, because we know there's, as in with all, cheating and academic integrity breaches, certain cohorts are more prone to this, whether they're pathway students, whether they're from particular countries. And again, having lived in particular parts of Asia other than Australia myself, rote learning and copying is not a bad thing in many parts of Asia. And the students come into another context in Australia or New Zealand, and it's a real shock that we're asking them to be independent critical thinkers and acknowledge their sources very, very carefully. So I think this is part of an ongoing discussion. Where we'll be in a year, I am not sure, but I think part of building in this uncertainty, building in the sense that this is an evolving technology and that we need to be as educated as we can and educating our students to use this. They will need to be able to use this, whether it changes the fields they're going into or eradicates the area they thought they were going to go into, or whether it opens up fantastic new possibilities. Because again, generative AI, it has so many possibilities within research, and it's not a topic for today, but it absolutely opens up many, many fields.
Thank you. I just want to refer to two comments from James Gniel. James, you say if the question is about students first as advertised, why no student reps on the panel? We're very aware of that. We tried very hard to get some students. We got one at 6 o'clock last night. As far as I was concerned, they hadn't gone through the conversation. They hadn't sort of mingled with the panel. So I will take responsibility for that, but it is always our intention to get students. Sometimes it's more difficult to get them. And James, also I imagine it will be even more deliciously chaotic in a year. I like your turn of phrase, and that deliciously chaotic, and the fingers in the dike, and the heads in the sand will be under more pressure than ever. I think your metaphors are really quite opposite. So let's actually ask some questions relating to students. Let's start with Jennie again. How do you get students to understand their responsibilities as students in this rapidly changing environment of technology development?
Well, as I said, right from the start, we were very public in taking an educational approach. We actually said we'll embrace AI, and there was a bit of pushback to that. But again, acknowledging we've been using forms of artificial intelligence in our teaching and learning for a long time, but this is the generative AI aspect of it. We've actually involved the students as much as possible. So they've been involved in the community of practice. When and just recently, we went through a whole consultation process around our policies. Not only did we put that out to the whole university community, including the students for comment, but we formed a student focus group because, again, we really wanted the students' input into what we were doing and what was appropriate in terms of, again, mitigating risk, educating the students. So we have compulsory academic integrity modules the students need to take from day one, and that's one thing. But we've also put up a lot of web pages and materials for them. And that's for staff and our students, because again, some of the staff have come to this a little bit late as well, the heads and sand folk. And again, it's making sure that when they're ready to look at those materials, we can take them to it. We also have adopted a policy here of what we call early offer, where it's a first time breach. And if it's a first time breach, and we are finding certainly in terms of academic integrity breaches, the use of generative AI shot to the top of our list for 2023 in terms of types of breaches. But if it's a first time breach and the student admits the error of their ways, we've actually opted to do a range of things that are more around education, counselling, training than taking a hard line and say you fail. So I think, and letting the students know that we'd rather they came clean, we'd rather see our breach rates, our detected breach rates go up for a while, as long as we're actually talking to them and getting them to talk to us about how they're using it. Because as Jason said, it's not just a simple thing of them putting it in ChatGPT, spitting out an answer. You know, the uses of it, we think our students are still fairly naive in their use of generative AI, but it is changing and their use of it will change.
Jason, do you want to add or take us in a slightly different direction to that question?
I can take us in a slightly different direction. We're taking a very similar approach here, and our colleagues, particularly in the UQ Library and the Graduate Research School, because HDR students are also a part of this equation as well, have been very active in being, you know, as open about this and communicative as possible. Some of the other work that we've been doing is to really try to deeply understand exactly what Jennie's just referred to, how students are using this. So we've had hour-long conversations with over 80 students now to really try and unpack the nuts and bolts of how they're fitting this technology within their learning. The other thing that we're trying to do is that I think we're trying to get a better sense of the longer-term systemic issues that generative AI has brought to the surface. So there are numerous things on top of academic integrity that have been bubbling away in the background that we've kind of let sit, and now this has really brought them to the fore. So for example, we're trying to understand what the journey is for our school leavers and what kind of messages they're getting about their learning from sort of year 8 through to the point where they're coming to university, because that's an important part of the puzzle here. You know, if they're going to be successful in integrating these new tools into their learning, is their prior experience helping them with that? Our non-school leavers as well, we're also trying to understand that experience. But the point here is that we're trying to go deep and get a real feel for what the kind of longitudinal journey is for students, so that we can figure out what the appropriate or inappropriate use of these tools might be within that context.
Right. I just want to ask a question that Luke Zafir has asked. Students are nervous and fearful, but I don't want this to be the case. Are we waiting for ethics to be created by regulatory bodies, or should we be co-creating these ethics in every course with students, publishing these results, taking risks to academic integrity so that we can develop the ethics in a holistic way? How do each of you feel about this issue? So let me start with Helen, given that, you know, the first part was the regulator, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. I think we can walk and chew gum. So I think we do need stuff that is happening at the government level and at the regulation level, because there's a difference between educational technologies and technology that you can sell to education. So there's a lot of these tools are not actually designed as educational tools. They're not there with the learning centered, and that's what they're for. They're just things that are handy, you know, for students or can be used. So I think it is necessary to look at some of the ethical questions, like the bias of training data and the transparency of those sort of things at a whole of government level, or even, you know, the EU level. So I think there's a need for that. I think there's a need for institutions to decide what they think is appropriate for their whole of institution. That's their responsibility. And I absolutely don't think at all that that should mean that individual academics can't be having conversations with students about what is the learning outcome that we're assessing with this assessment, and how are those things linked, and what does that mean about your use of tools, and why have we set the use of tools that way for this? Like, all of those things can and should happen at the same time. We don't want students to be fearful, but that doesn't mean we just can't have any rules or regulations around this.
Jason or Jennie, do you want to make a response?
Look, I'd love to pitch in on this one. I think, look, this is actually right at the crux of what I think we should be doing. So I think we've taken an approach of saying that what we are trying to teach our students and our staff is responsible and ethical use of generative AI. And that's about it. And it's actually prompting those bigger conversations about ethical learning and personal responsibility. And I think that's a really great thing, because I think we might have moved away from that a bit. So actually just saying, look, this does open up those bigger conversations, as well as those conversations about, you know, this is part of being a critical thinker, which is just core to being part of a member of a university community. So So it does open up all those kinds of things. And then you've got the other side, which is the practical side. And I can see there's comments in the chat about, you know, lots of false positives in the similarity detection tools. And yeah, that's absolutely the case. So with our academic integrity officers, and we have a whole system to deal with academic integrity that sits under me, those people, we've given the confidence, I think, and the training to say, make those calls. And I can say that around about half of those reported breaches turn out to be false positives. But they're making that call early on rather than taking a student all the way through a really quite stressful academic integrity formal process. So we've got the kind of different sides to this issue, the trying to educate and train and get people to think in the first place, which also means for our staff thinking about it, you know, assessment design and education design that doesn't lead people into a path of collusion, plagiarism, and all sorts of other kind of academic integrity breaches, you know, alongside generative AI misuse. And then also just making sure that people understand that, you know, there are ramifications when we find that there has been inappropriate use.
There's a question, and there are a couple of questions that have come previously from participants, and there are a couple on the screen that about what do we give up? So what are some of the things that it now makes sense that we give up that have historically been part of the higher education experience? And then David Curtin made this comment: over time, there are skills that our ancestors had to learn, horse riding, sword fighting, etc., that we no longer need to learn, indeed, in our lifetimes with the advent of self-driving cars. It is possible that the skill of driving a car will no longer be necessary. In respect to critical thinking, will AI render writing an obsolete skill, but the critical reading of what AI has produced an even more important skill? So, Jason, can I get you to respond to that, and I'll get Jennie to respond to it as well?
It's a good question. To me, there are kind of two parts to this. I think we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. I think there are a lot of things about the fundamental skills of learning, of writing, of thinking that I think are foundational, because for many of the professions that we're in, you've got to be able to think on the spot. You can't go and check something on ChatGPT if you're in a classroom with 35 students and they're climbing up the walls and running around all over the place. So I teach future teachers, so this is something I think about a lot. The other part of that equation, of course, is that we need foundational knowledge. You know, it's hard to think critically about something if you have nothing to think critically about. So there is an important component for a lot of these things that I think will remain. In terms of what we give up, I think that there are some things where, you know, for example, why would I spend a whole lot of my time correcting student grammar? Right? At this stage, that seems like not the best use of my time and not the best use of the students' interaction with me. We can focus on more kind of conceptual issues and things that I think are going to be really important for their careers. Same thing goes for things like referencing. So there are some of these kinds of really more procedural aspects of the learning process that we've perhaps spent a lot of time on that are maybe not as important. But what I would hope is that some of those really foundational kind of knowledge skills that I think are things that we will continue to need remain part of what we help students to learn. We don't just want to go straight down the path of all AI all day and forgetting about those basic skills. It's hard to operate without them, I think.
Jennie, thank you.
Yeah, look, I think there are some skills that we don't need anymore to the same extent. I mean, I had to learn log tables. No one does that anymore. I had to, in year 6 at school, we had to learn, I remember reciting very long stanzas of very long poems we had to memorize. That's a skill that over time, because of, you know, the written word, we don't put emphasis on anymore as a core skill. So at the same time, you know, in Jason's area, my education school staff tell me they no longer assess lesson plans. I mean, why would you assess a lesson plan when, you know, a generative AI can turn up a perfectly good lesson plan? So there are some things now that we'll say, well, we take that for granted, but we want to examine and explore the next step. So, you know, what you'd then look at in the lesson plan is kind of, you know, pretty obvious, concentrating on the content, the teaching pedagogy, all that sort of thing. So I don't think this is a bad thing. I think it's actually getting people to look at the things that maybe they don't think about so much. So privacy is a huge issue with the generative AI tools. I mean, it's one of the reasons why researchers really flounder with it, and it's one of the reasons why a lot of corporate firms won't use it. Because again, whatever you put in is in the public domain if it's an open source area. So I think sort of teaching people to be careful about what they read and how they read. The critical thinking skills, as Jason said, are going to become even more important. And also recognising that, again, these sources are only as good as what is in there out in the public domain. So being aware that there will be bias, that the kind of material that's out there that gets replicated over and over tends towards a certain majority view in lots of fields.
Thank you. Carol Oliver put in a question earlier, and Carol is an active responder on the chat side as well. But Carol, you asked the question, is an AI an opportunity to teach critical, creative and reflective thinking, then a threat to integrity? So let's start off with the regulator. What does the regulator, Helen, think about that approach from Carol?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's all of those things. And the challenge for all of us is working out where we want to set the boundaries and how we want to shape the future. I mean, I think to come back to Jason's point, and I think about AI more now in terms of award integrity rather than academic integrity. I mean, academic integrity is a function of that, but what I'm really interested in is the award integrity. So I think we're past the point where you could say every single piece of assessment we can be absolutely sure has been completed with integrity. But what are the key ways that we're going to be sure that the learning outcomes have been met? So what is the whole suite of assessment across a student's course of study that means we're confident they're ready to graduate? And so I think if we shift that focus slightly from academic integrity to award integrity, it allows us to do some of the other things that we're bringing in. So it allows us to think more carefully about what are our learning outcomes? Are they still right? And how are we assessing those learning outcomes? And how are we making sure that at particular critical moments, those assessment items are high validity, high integrity, high authenticity? So it's a slightly different programmatic kind of view that frees up some of the time and to the what do we stop doing or what do we just stop waiting? Things that are there to give feedback to the learner and you can't ensure the integrity because they're an online quiz. Well, yeah, so don't give it a heap of marks and maybe have it marked by AI so the feedback's instantaneous. There's different ways of doing things. So I think if we just kind of, sometimes I take the view of never waste a good crisis. Like this might be the thing that allows us to look at all the problems we knew were there, but there wasn't the urgency to change them and say, okay, we have to do things differently because these tools are amazing. They are tools. We want people to use them and to capitalize on what they can do. But it's still our responsibility as the higher education sector, my responsibility as, integrity of the system to say, but it's still got to mean something. We're not handing out bachelors of optional attendance here. Like we're handing an individual a degree and certifying that they, the human, has done something or can do something. So it's, it's complex, but it's all of those things. It's a threat and an opportunity.
So what I'm hearing you saying, it's actually an opportunity to rethink, reframe and renew, but at the same time have real clarity around purpose.
Yeah.
How are you going to do that? I
was going to make Jason and Jennie do that.
Okay, Jason.
I'm just providing the push.
Jason, how do you do that?
So in the resource that we created, Assessment Reform for the Age of Artificial Intelligence, we had two key principles in there. One of them is about assessment academic integrity and thinking about where we need to have security around all of that. And I've been talking about that as the acute problem. The other one refers to what I've been calling the chronic problem, which is what and how do we teach now that these things are a reality? Even if AI develops no further from where it is today, then we still have some serious questions that we need to be asking. And I think that is where we probably need to be having those two conversations in parallel. So we can spend a lot of time focusing on making assessment secure. That's important. We need to do that. We need to be absolutely certain that the award has integrity to it, as Helen has just talked about. But we also, at the same time and in parallel, need to have that broader discussion about what the purpose of higher education is now in the age of AI. And some people, I think, argue that that's a little bit too much of a stretch, while other people are arguing that that's probably not going far enough. The reality is probably somewhere in between. And I think, the fact that there have been a lot of problems, not just around academic integrity, that have been surfaced through this process over the last year, would suggest that we do need to be having a broader conversation. Yes, security of assessment, but what and how we're teaching as well is important here.
So this has got something to do with academic boards creating some sort of leadership in addressing those issues, at least opening up the discussion much more publicly. What other venues do you think that this conversation, in inverted commas, can and could take place?
Well, I'm happy to throw that one out there in the sense of, certainly it's actually a conversation our academic board is scheduled to have in June, because we've got our 2023 reports to table at that meeting and discuss. And again, I think it's really interesting. And I've just the headlines on that. Our detected cheat rate is the same. It's 3.8% of our students and it's been 3.8, 3.8, 3.7 over the last 3 years. It's consistent. But the modes of how they're cheating have changed. So contract cheating still exists. It's tiny. I think it's 7% of those detected breaches. Collusion is still pretty high. Exam cheating has really dropped. And again, that goes to the integrity and security of how we're doing exams, which I'm really comfortable with. The generative AI is now 32% of all detected cheating. So that's a conversation prompter at academic board. The reason why we've made it the whole theme for our Teaching and Learning Festival is that is a whole university-wide area where people can put in and talk about their particular aspect of it. So whether it's a poster or a 5-minute talk or a whole keynote session. So it enables people to be part of that discussion at a level at which they feel comfortable, and students are welcome to join that as well. So I think, within the universities, we're actually moving really, really quickly on this. It's also recognising that the rest of society sees this in very different ways. They'll see this as the fake porn, and that sort of thing. So there's very different understandings of what generative AI is doing. And we're very much focused in universities, I think, still on the written word, but just being aware, of course, that there's many other aspects to this. So I think it's part of that continuum of just saying, look, this is a dialogue, it's an open conversation. To get back to Helen's point, there are some things we don't give on, and I think we want our students to come out having got their award, their degree, their diploma, whatever, with deep discipline knowledge. That's a fundamental. Without those, and I can see some of the comments in the chat on this, you need those fundamentals to be able to then make those decisions. Whether you're a vet or a nurse or a philosopher, you need that knowledge first, and then the skills to be able to take that knowledge into the world. But it is something I think we really actively think about with our students, because of course the world is changing and the workforce is changing.
So Jennie, there's a question from Amber here. How are you detecting the use of AI in student assessment submissions at Adelaide?
Oh, well, it's like everyone else. The similarity software will only go so far, but we do that. We also sort of, within smaller cohorts, often the course coordinator will pick there's been some collusion or some similarity there. It's also making sure that we minimise the opportunities for that. So where we're finding it's happening is mostly in assessments that are worth around about 20% or under, which is encouraging, because I think most of our staff have thought really hard about major assessments, whether that's an exam or active learning, something hands-on, an oral presentation. It's very hard to get Gen AI to do your oral presentation for you. So it's actually sort of saying, well, there are certain, again, it's only as good as the systems that it's in. And there are similarities. If you set an assessment, you can usually pick if there's a trend where people are giving the same kind of answer, even if they've had it tweaked through the Gen AI a few times. So far, we've been able to pick that up. But not to say that we think there's still some that's going undetected, which is why we're talking to students about how they're using it.
Jason, what's happening at UQ?
Very similar to what Jennie's described at Adelaide. I think we're also having high-level discussions. We have a specific assessment subcommittee of the academic board, which is under the auspices of the Teaching, Learning and Student Experience Committee. And they are tasked with constantly looking at these matters and thinking about how we can use our standard quality assurance and risk management processes to try and integrate this in, whether there needs to be updating to some of those processes, whether we need to think about how we're managing integrity in different ways. Those are all open topics of discussion that we're constantly revisiting. So we're not shying away from having the conversation about whether we've got the right tools in place to be able to detect when some of these new technologies are being used inappropriately. And that will probably be an ongoing conversation, again, as Jennie's alluded to. you know, I think we're pretty well placed because we have that committee that is tasked with thinking about the you know, integrity of the assessments that we're assigning to our students. And they do a great job of that.
Robert McMurtry from UTS College says, how can we make our assessments AI proof? Or in fact, is that the way to go? Is that the wrong way to resolve the problem? Jennie, let's get back to you.
Well, again, looking at the chat, you know, this is true. I mean, you know, when I was talking about oral assessments, I was talking about face-to-face, because online you can get generative AI to do a deep fake of you doing an oral presentation too. So, you know, it's an evolving field. I think what we're trying to do is say, well, what we want to be able to do too is make sure that we do, without over-assessing, but we do not just one assessment, we do many assessments of students with many different kinds of assessments and many different tasks that we've set them. One of the things we try and do is tailor it now. We suggest to staff that, you know, pick a contemporary issue, because again, the more contemporary, the better, or pick something where you specifically say, I just want you to concentrate on these 3 sources and critically reflect on something. So it's getting harder and harder. But I think this gets back to the fact that, and again, someone put this in the chat, the vast majority of students do not cheat. The vast majority of our students are there to learn and do the right thing, and they're anxious because they want to do the right thing. So part of our view is educate them and say, this is okay, this is not. And then at the level of the course coordinator, it's saying when you can use it, when you can't. So we have generative AI where usage in our courses, which is completely okay. So where, you know, someone will say, and I know we did this for one of the 3rd-year dental students, you know, put this scenario into ChatGPT, what do they come up with the patient's diagnosis, then comment on it, what do you think? So those kind of things, as long as the students know where the boundaries are, what is okay, what is not okay. Our guidelines say, for instance, if you're allowed to use generative AI, that's fine, but here's how you need to reference it and say where you used it and how you used it. So again, the vast majority of our students and our staff just want to know what is okay for them to do so they can use it to the extent that is going to help their learning, not get them into trouble. And then it's the energy and time that we all have to spend on all those other academic integrity breaches, small numbers of students, often repeat offenders, where, you know, that takes up the time and energy and the emotional, you know, stress for our academic and professional staff too.
Let's continue on the idea of assessment. There's just this sort of juncture about the interchange between knowledge production, knowledge construction, and how we measure students' learning really lead us to ask, perhaps we need to rethink the purpose of assessment. And if we're rethinking the purpose of assessment, Helen, what would the role then be for TEQSA in terms of their accreditations and their views around standards?
Yeah, so obviously in the current higher education standards framework, we have specific standards around assessment. I think it's 1.4.3, but I don't quite sleep with it under my pillow, so that could be wrong. But essentially says that methods of assessment are capable of ensuring that the learning outcomes have been met. Along those lines, it's not prescriptive as to what those methods of assessment should be. It recognises that is best left to the institutions. They're the ones filled with people who are experts in this, experts in their field, and experts in teaching and learning. So it's about the suitability of the assessment and the ability of that whole suite of assessment to then ensure that somebody's ready to graduate with an award. So I think I don't want to take us too off track, but there was a comment that made me kind of bring this up to the front again, which is one of the big things that we're going to have to grapple with is what this really means for English language requirements and for first language requirements. So that is a really, I think, big thorny issue that needs a national conversation, because English language requirements do not just exist in the TEQSA Act and the threshold standards, they exist in migration regulations and a whole heap of places. But it's a very interesting thing to think through from a student perspective. If one of the best things about these tools is that they can help, you know, non-English background speakers demonstrate what they really know, but how does that sit with our expectations about what it means to have an award that you've gained in an English language context? So, yeah, very complex.
So what I'm hearing is, from a regulator's point of view, the assessment has to be defensible. And
Correct.
It's got to have a purpose.
Yep.
what opportunities do you think we have now to rethink the purpose and practice of assessment?
Was that me or Jennie? Sorry.
Well, sorry, all these people with J's except Helen.
Jason, do you want to take that one first?
I can have a crack at that first. Thanks, Jennie. One thing that I think has been a constant mantra over the last 18 months is that we need to think more about the process. Learning is, after all, a developmental process that occurs over time. And the way that we infer how students are progressing through that journey is that we take snapshots. And those snapshots are represented in the form of an artifact, often an essay, a lab report, or a completed exam script. Now, we already had problems with the kind of inferences that we could make on the basis of those artifacts because they are that snapshot, an outcome, if you like, rather than the process itself. So this is an opportunity for us to think about ways that we might be able to get a better sense of how that process is playing out for every student, no matter what their starting point was or what challenges they face along the way. And wouldn't it be great if we had a better sense of what that trajectory looks like for our students? Of course, that's far easier said than done. However, I think that emerging technologies provide potential opportunities to help us to understand that trajectory for our students, as well as causing problems and bringing this to the surface. So yes, I absolutely see that there are opportunities here for rethinking what we do. And wouldn't it be great if we really had a good sense of how our students are learning over time?
Before Jennie answers that, do you think universities are up to it or up for it?
I think we need help. I think we need help, and that's okay, because the other side of this is that, of course, we're not alone. Every educational system in the world is grappling with this same problem right now, and I've seen a level of cooperation, particularly between universities, other tertiary providers, and secondary education that I've never seen before. We've got a very strong working relationship here in Queensland with the Queensland Curriculum and Assessment Authority and the Queensland Government. We're trying to figure it out together, and that gives me hope that although that this is a difficult problem we face, that we are working on it together gives me hope that we might be able to figure it out, as hard as it is.
Jennie.
Yeah, and look, I think this right early on, we were talking with the South Australian government as well, and the Department for Education. I think we've been on the same page from day one, which has been helpful. But just in a more in a broader context, look, a lot of these, again, it's a continuum. We've been talking about assessment and particularly the nature of the exam and that sort of thing for years, many years. But I think that came to a head through COVID. When everyone moved to online assessments, and some were completely unsupervised and some were not, and all of us around the world relaxed our requirements just to keep students at universities and get them through. And then everyone's tightened up again since then, because the issue there is, how could you tell that the students were actually doing that assessment themselves? Now, had we had generative AI through COVID, I think that would have been an entire disaster. But the timing of it has not been too bad. So we knew, certainly from our point of view, we knew it was coming before COVID, but COVID kind of slowed that down. But I think it's a good conversation to have. Certainly my university's up for it. And we're talking about this actively because we're forming a new university. So it's actually at the core of what we're talking about right now. And we're talking about the way that we want learners to be able to, in a sense, put up their hand and say, I'm ready to do an assessment task now because I think I know the content. And that might not align with an exam time. And we think that's actually probably a more equitable way to do it, because we have different people to learn in different ways. We have growing numbers of students with disabilities in our sector, and it's a way to sort of accommodate different learning styles, different learning patterns. So that's an active conversation. The challenges are, and also the big one always, the accrediting bodies. So we can say we would do away with various forms of assessment, but the various accrediting bodies for many of our accredited programs, and whether that's business or nursing or many others, engineering, are kind of horrified by that. So this is where there's a disjunct between what we see as the learning progression and that whole process of learning and that journey for a student, as opposed to an accrediting board that says, we just want a qualified nurse who can do X, Y, and Z, and we need that examined and an evidence that has happened. So this is a tension, and I think the accrediting bodies would acknowledge that tension, but there isn't a solution to it at the moment.
And I think the reality is that assessment is not just one thing, and it doesn't just have one purpose. And so, I think the most easy way to conceptualize it is the way Danny Lou from UCID talks about it, with the two lanes. Is this the assessment for learning or the assessment of learning, and keeping those things, both of those things are really, really critical. And so it doesn't mean that an exam has no place just because, it's not really used to inform a student's learning. That's not its purpose. It's doing a different part of the assessment workload. And so I think it's really critical to understand those things. I think for the professional bodies, they are the kind of co-accreditors, right? So for a lot of universities, even though you have self-accrediting authority, you're not the sole accreditor of your award. And so those people those institutions have a really critical role in this as well. We ran a webinar for the professional bodies on the RFI that we're putting out to help them understand that, we're pushing the sector to transform. And so we really need the professional bodies to be engaging with that process as well and thinking about what it means and how can they have flexibility, because some types of assessment for which they may be very wedded no longer have any integrity. And so they've got to really take a step back and think about how they can. We all want the same thing, which is graduates who are safe practitioners, but we all just have to be willing to engage in a process of what we need to change to get there now in the age of generative AI.
Fabian D'Souza is going to take us a little bit in a slightly different direction around assessment, but I think his question is an interesting one. Do you think that AI tools provide an opportunity to move away from text-based assessments towards project-based learning tools, where AI tools have a positive impact? This would resolve some integrity issues. Students know that they will need AI skills in the workplace, so they should be encouraged to use these tools. Who'd like to respond to Fabian's question?
Well, I'll just pitch in and say absolutely. I think that's great. Look, we are trying to sort of educate our staff. And I know a couple of comments have come up about, well, what about the lecturers? What about the staff? And that's just as big a piece of the puzzle for us. And we're doing a lot of professional development for our staff. Because we, again, and people are coming to this at different stages. So some people were early adopters, jumped straight in, and they were not just in computer science. I have to say we had staff who were really involved in generative AI from across the university, although I did notice it was very gendered. It was almost all male at the beginning. That's changed now. But certainly we're trying to sort of get people to think about positive ways to use generative AI. And one of the really simple, straightforward ones is the instant feedback. So being able to sort of feed something into generative AI and then prompt it and have that feedback almost, within a minute or two about ways in which that formula, that question, that issue could be improved. So I absolutely see that this is a way we could use it very positively and a different way that we could be turning assessments. And again, it gets back to that, what makes that work? It's going to be asking the right questions and that critical thinking element.
Jason, do you want to make a response?
Thanks, Judyth. Yes, everything that Jennie said, fully agree. There is a tension here, and I think the tension comes through this idea of AI literacy. I think is quite a common way of wrapping this up. And what I mean by tension here is I think that there is part of this which is about trying to understand the role that the technology is playing in the workplace or elsewhere. But we've also got to be careful that that technology is potentially going to radically change. So what is our responsibility in terms of preparing students to get started in their career, as opposed to preparing them for 10, 20 years down the track when the sorts of tools and technologies that they're likely to be using will look vastly different. The technologies we use now are vastly different from 20 years ago, and things only seem to be accelerating. So I think that there is a part of this where we need to think about how we help students to develop the kind of lifelong learning skills that are really specific to the age of AI. How much of that is about the technologies and tools themselves, and how much of that is about the students understanding their own strengths and capabilities, and how we help to foster that in meaningful ways to allow them to adapt to a lot of change, I think is an open question. But I think it's an important one that we probably need to talk about more.
I think the other one that we've got to not lose sight of, but it's really easy to, is the massive equity considerations that this all throws up. Because if we're saying, oh, students should be able to use AI and it should be built in, there's hundreds, thousands of these tools. Lots of them have a monthly fee. Some students can afford to subscribe to 30 of them and also don't have to work. And so they've got plenty of time to play with them and become expert users. So there's a really big equity considerations here as well that are hard to think through, but we've got to keep thinking about them.
And there's the diversity element too about students all have different ways of learning, different ways of experiencing the world, and different ways of understanding content. So I think there's certainly issues we need to focus on. Abby Cathcart's is going to take us in a slightly different direction, but I think it's a good one. We've been talking about students, but we haven't been talking about the lecturers and the teachers. So Abby says, how will educators be able to support students to engage ethically with AI when the indicators are that academics are feeling overwhelmed and underprepared? Early findings from our current national survey of staff in Australian universities indicates that almost a third of staff have never used AI in their work.
And I think she's qualified that by saying knowingly, because of course this is, it's hard to imagine now that people haven't used it in some way, even without thinking about it. But look, I think we've actually tackled this head on, and I think having a very open conversation is the best thing, rather than people thinking that, you know, either use of generative AI and discussions of it are for someone else. It's actually everyone's issue and everyone's problem. And I think it's fine for everyone to have a view on it. But when we say it's everyone's issue and everyone's problem, not everyone needs to have the same expertise or amount of knowledge, and that will differ per discipline and per people's role, which is why I think it's been really helpful for us to have the community of practice. So it draws all those threads together. But it also, what we've set up is a central network that sits under me, where we've got an academic integrity manager and a whole lot of academic integrity officers who are academic and professional staff sitting out in the schools and faculties, and they are the go-to people. So they are the people that we really train, that we make sure are really on top of things. They're on top of the, you know, latest cheat sites, as well as the, you know, the latest generative AI issues. So that whenever there is a question or an issue, their immediate colleagues know that they are the go-to person. So it's about trying to have people have that confidence to start asking the questions and to start experimenting. We've also had lots of workshops on how to use it. And that's the other thing, especially run by our learning designers, on and how to use it ethically, how to put these technologies into a course in a way that's actually going to enhance learning and decrease workload for staff as well. Because again, part of this is around saying this should not be increasing people's workloads. It's shifting the workload, it's shifting the detection, it's shifting the responsibility about, you know, sort of ethical use, responsible use, and opening up those conversations. But it shouldn't be now saying, oh, it's, you know, sort of a fraction of everyone's workload that you must do this. It's just kind of part of the fabric of being in a university. We're just trying to make it as easy as possible for our staff to understand that.
Jason, have you got a response or a comment, observation?
I do. It's a great question. And it is absolutely a thorny issue. Again, I think we can learn a lot from our colleagues, particularly in secondary sectors. You know, there are many schools around the country where they simply can't get a teacher to be in the room, you know, let alone anything else, you know, with the workforce shortages and everything that are there. And it's sort of the classic academic development problem, isn't it? How do we get the right support to the right people at the right time to be able to make good decisions about what to do in their units? I think working together here is absolutely critical, because the pace of change means that I think the more that we can learn from other sectors and from other parts of the world, the better job that we can do of providing those right support structures around our colleagues to try and get up to speed on this. Not everybody's going to be as interested in this, and not everybody's going to be as engaged as we've talked about. So how do we make sure that all the rungs of the ladder are there, rather than going out and saying, oh, look at this wonderful new tool, and here's this super user who can do all these amazing things. For a lot of our colleagues, that's sort of giving them the ladder and then taking the first 5 rungs away. You know, how am I ever going to get from where I am to the point where I can integrate AI into my practice in that way? So I think we've got to be really mindful of providing a range of resources at the right time, at the right level. And I think working together is the key to doing that as quickly as possible.
So we've got 1 minute. One point that you would advise any university, any tertiary, even schools, to start this sort of transformational journey that AI offers for reinvigorating, redefining learning. Jason, you're still on in front of me, so.
Right. Think about the learning. Yes, we need to think about secure assessment, but what does it mean to learn in the age of AI? And that's a really important question that you have to think about alongside the assessment integrity piece.
Okay, Jennie?
And I'm just conscious also we've got people from the TAFE sector in the chat. So look, if you're at an institution that isn't well resourced to do this, there are lots of resources outside universities now, whether it's webinars like this, there's lots of material online. So I would encourage you to try and look at the resources that are now out there and see if they can be brought into your institutions, or at least to start a discussion.
And Helen, very quickly.
Last one, put together a multidisciplinary team. There's lots of people in your institution whose job it is to drive forward strategy. So link up your learning and teaching people with the people whose job it is to drive forward strategy so that you can keep all the balls in the air.
And thank you, everybody, those of you who attended, but in particular, the members of the panel. I think it's been a lively, insightful and helpful discussion. If I could just finish today reminding people that the Studiosity 2024 Tracy Braytag Prize for Academic Integrity has now been advertised, and the criteria there on the Studiosity site, and every year we keep getting more prizes or more applications, and really the quality of work that's happening in our universities, for me, as both an insider and outsider, makes me feel confident and comfortable that universities are acting responsibly, not just reacting to an issue as it's emerged. So thank you again for your time today, and I wish all of you a great week, and I look forward to seeing you again later in the year for our next webinar. Thanks a lot. Bye.